Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm David Geiger, your host. Today on Farm Here Daily, celebrating 20 years of the Renewable Fuel Standard. We're going to talk with Iowa Renewable Fuels Association Executive Director Monte Shaw about that. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, making sure folks are informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we have Monte Shaw, Executive Director of the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association. Monte, I'm so glad to have you here because we are celebrating an important event for farmers in Iowa, and that is the advent of getting renewable fuels into the fuel supply. The Renewable Fuel Standard turns 20 years old. What does that make? What does that mean? What does that feel like? What's your expectations and thoughts of this day?
You know, while I temporarily have this beard on here, I can it shows that I'm actually one of the few people you can interview who can remember all the way back to 2005. So, lots of different memories. I think it's the time to think back and try to talk about just how important renewable fuels have been to agriculture. And they need to be again, and we can get into that if you want. But, I grew up kind of came of age, you might say, in the 1980s, kind of in the middle of the farm crisis. It was not a pleasant time to be involved in agriculture. There was no encouragement for me to stay on the farm. Maybe that's just because my dad thought I was a bad farmer, but, went out and did other things. And then somehow, a decade later, in the year 2000, found myself in the ethanol policy world. And so we worked I was in DC when the RFS compromise was actually solidified with the oil industry in the year 2003. It took us 2 more years to get it through Congress. I'm not sure you can get legislation through Congress anymore of this nature, but it really set the stone. I don't want to take anything away from the RFS. At the same time, a lot of things were already in motion. MTBE had been banned in California, New York. The oil refiners were getting sued. They were looking for a way to replace both MTBE and it's less known, but they were also being ordered to reduce the amount of benzene because it had been determined to be a known carcinogen by the EPA. All of these things came together, and the obvious and by that point in time, affordable solution was for octane in fuel that didn't kill you was ethanol. And so that culminated with the 2005 passage of the Renewable Fuel Standard. And then once that was there as kind of a framework, we saw really rapid adoption, way faster than was even called for under the RFS itself. But, people saw the writing on the wall, and just the way that turned around agriculture has been, something that I'll treasure as part of my career.
You are right in the fact that I was not there originally when the RFS got started. I was probably like 13 years old or something like that, 14 years old.
Thanks.
A little bit before those times. Sorry, gotta do a little bit of a flex. I don't have too many people I feel comfortable enough to do that with on this program, but you are one of them. I'm just teasing. But for real, in terms of, I've just known about the last 10 years of the RFS, maybe 12 years of the RFS. And in that time, I know that there have been a lot of challenges. It feels like most of those last 12 years, there have been some fight or another trying to get even what was written by Congress enacted by policy through the EPA.
Yeah. And this might come as a shock to you, but maybe not to most people. When, in the early years of the RFS, even though that was there, and again, I don't want to undermine its influence. I think the fact that the RFS was there and there was this schedule and you were going to have to use more and more and more renewable fuels over time, they just said, okay, we're going to have to do it. We'll do it. And so, all of a sudden in a couple of years' time, not 10 years' time, but in a couple of years' time, you really had, ethanol blends, E10 specifically, go from kind of, in a few states in the Midwest to all across the country, to all 50 states. And huge demand for ethanol, huge demand for corn. And it really sucked up all the extra corn that our farmers had been producing in the latter half of the 80s and all of the 90s. And then they were getting a check from the government to make themselves whole. And all of a sudden, we had a market demand for the product, and farmers were actually farming for the market. And it brought in all kinds of research and improvements, and it's just been amazing how it's transformed agriculture. But I think the reason we went from maybe those pretty exciting head in the clouds early days to when it became more of a fight was, once we'd saturated the E10 market at about 14 billion gallons, the law called for it to go beyond that. And at that point in time, there's been some shifting as oil companies have become more involved in biofuels, and they've seen things like EVs as more of a threat and stuff like that. You've seen some shift, but back then, like you mentioned, a decade ago, 12 years ago, whatever, they really didn't want to have to go beyond that. And the RFS was pushing and making it, the easiest way to comply with it would have been to sell higher ethanol blends. Actually, they determined the easiest way to comply with it was to make a lot of renewable diesel and use those extra RINs. So there was a lot of push to not have it be implemented at its full levels. We fought that back and forth, and we're trying to get it back on track today. And the EPA, the Trump EPA, has a proposal out with numbers in it that we really like that would get the RFS back on track. And but that's a draft, and so you'll have to interview me again this fall when they finalize it to see if we're finally going to get there. But it was intended by Congress to be a market moving mechanism, and that's what a lot of people forget. It was not intended to memorialize what was already going in the marketplace, although you could argue in the early years that's what it did. It was really intended to move the markets, and really since 2017, 2018, we've pretty much saturated the E10 market. And all those fights have been because we want to sell more ethanol, and certain folks are not enamored with that idea.
Absolutely. And then we've had the advent of EVs, where people have said we need to go straight to EVs when we have very efficient, and honestly, I hear a lot of really positive things about flex fuel EVs, where you have electric for some parts and then you have fuel that sometimes includes ethanol, oftentimes includes ethanol as well. What does the future hold then as you take a look at the last 20 years and you look ahead to the next 20 years?
Well, in our 10-year anniversary for IRFA, or was it? Trying to remember which anniversary it was now, but we did a booklet. We had our staff make predictions for the future, and I was all about mid blends and things like that. And here we are still trying to get E15. So change can take a very long time, sometimes a stupefyingly amount of time. And I think that's been one of the changes in DC is there's been a real shift from I think the old way of doing legislation, where groups got together and they worked it out and they hashed it out and you worked it through committees, you did some of that stuff. And that's what really allowed us to have the RFS 1 and then the expansion of it in a couple years later in RFS 2. And obviously the political stars have to align. But now we just see a lot of like preferred outcomes. So that's what I call EVs. We went from somehow wanting to reduce carbon emissions from transportation, which biofuels do very effectively. And actually, if you look at the whole start to finish, do better than electric vehicles in the vast, well, and it's certainly the majority of cases. And we went to like just interest group politics. Well, we like this, so we want EVs. Or well, wait, your EV actually emits more carbon than a flex fuel vehicle. So why aren't we for flex fuel vehicles? Well, because we want EVs. So it seems like we've really lost kind of the policy making aspects of some of this stuff, and it's become more bumper sticker driven, more interest group driven, more politics than policy driven. And so it's really hard for me to know, does that pendulum swing back? I love history. Usually these pendulums come and they go. But who knows? We've entered, in an era where there's social media, and we're definitely seeing a different type of person be elected to these policy making. And that's not singled out any one person. you know, I sometimes, you know, we seem to have a lot of good social media personalities in Congress now. I'm not sure how many of them are interested in doing the tedious work it takes to actually craft major legislation, and then the time it takes to get it done. I mean, think about this: the American Petroleum Institute and the Renewable Fuels Association, which back then was the National Trade Association, agreed on basically the outline of the RFS legislation in 2003. So here, for the first time ever, you had the great compromise, it was called, between ethanol and oil, and it still took us 2 years to get it through Congress. That's a lot of roll up your sleeves and hard work and working out the details. And really, I give a lot of credit to it. If you think about how, for all the problems that people like to point out in the RFS, there's almost always something in the RFS, a mechanism that allows you to fix it. It was a very well thought out piece of legislation. Not perfect. We certainly didn't get everything the way we wanted it, or it'd be a little different. But it really was designed to work in the real world. And for the most part, when it's been properly implemented, it has. That was a long way of not answering your question. So, I mean, if you really wanted to reduce carbon, if that was your number one goal, I mean, I think you'd want a flex fuel hybrid. You'd want to plug it in, and when it runs out of battery, you'd want to have a low carbon ethanol. I mean, think about this: you could have a near zero carbon ethanol if you had the right farming practices and carbon capture, and then even the 15% of the what we typically call E85 that's not ethanol no longer has to be petroleum. It could actually be a renewable naphtha coming out of a renewable diesel plant or a SAF plant. So you could have a 100% basically carbon zero fuel in there. With the amount of energy it takes to build a battery, you can't beat that. You literally can't beat that. If you were honest about it and looked at all of the ramifications and where the electricity comes from and the amount of energy that goes into a battery, we have the tools at our disposal right now, if people wanted them, to have a biofuel that absolutely would reduce carbon emissions more than any EV. You'd have to get one that was running on 100% solar and wind, and that's hard to do because there's this thing called night when the wind doesn't blow. So this whole notion of calling EVs a zero emissions vehicle is just total bullcrap. There a lot of emissions went into building the battery, getting the rare earth metals, refining them. A lot of emissions go into putting the electricity on the grid, and so. I think if we could get a fair, scientifically based shake, we do just as well. The other thing is not everybody cares about carbon. Some people just care about, American energy independence. Well, that's certainly better for biofuels than batteries that we have to import the materials for, jobs. I mean, you name it. So I'm still bullish that, biofuels are going to be here for a long time to come. You've got cars that are going to be on the road for another 20 years. So first of all, right there, you're going to need biofuels. And then secondly, we have seen the automakers back off. There was all this talk, everything's going to be EV by 2030. And you're sitting there going, we don't have enough rare earth metals to do that. We don't have the capacity on the grid to do that. So I think, despite what some of these I talked about earlier, some of these bumper sticker aspirations by certain elected officials, I think there's this other thing called the real world. And when that rubber meets the road, I think biofuels have a long, very, very positive role to play.
This is Farm Here Daily. Monty will be back in just a moment, but first we're going to take a look at the marketplace. And there was a negative trade at the close for Friday. September corn, a penny and 3/4 down, 3.82 3/4, with December falling a penny and a half, 4.05 1/2. Soybeans in September 6 1/4 lower, 9.67 3/4, with November falling 6 1/4, 9.87 1/2. Soybean meal in September, $1 in the green, $276.60 a ton. September wheat, 3 3/4 down, 5.14 1/2, with December falling 4 cents at $5.35. In the livestock market, close for Friday, October live cattle, $6.25 a hundredweight in the red, $225.97. December fell $5.70 at $227.92. Feeder cattle in September, $9.25, down at $340.37, with October falling $9.25 as well, $339.22. Lean hogs in October, 25 cents a hundredweight weaker, $90.67, with December down 2 cents at $83.77 a hundredweight. That is the Friday market close. This is Farm Year Daily. Monte, I want to go back and look at the last 20 years and point out something you talked about a little earlier, which I think ultimately is described as misinformation. And I'm going to pull out two points. I know there's a lot more, but just as two primary points to emphasize the point. On maybe the extreme left, you may have the whole issue and misinformation around food versus fuel. And on the extreme right, you may have some misinformation about what's going on in terms of what renewable is and what green energy does and what that is ultimately for.
Yeah.
How does the renewable fuels groups like you, how do you think they are in terms of that debate when dealing with those now very strongly held beliefs or maybe just consistent and never-ending misinformation about those types of subjects?
Yeah, I mean, it's look, the good news about renewable fuels is we have strong supporters across the political spectrum. The bad news about renewable fuels is we have strong opponents across the political spectrum. So, I mean, I guess for me as a trade association guy, that's good because I it's like job security, right? Sometimes I wish I had a little less job security because of all the attacks we take, but it's really become more difficult. There are always groups that have their political agendas. There's a significant part of the environment, quote unquote, environmental community, and I want to be very clear. I did not say all of them, but there are groups out there who they have smart people. They know better. They literally use this to fundraise. They hate modern agriculture. They have their own agendas in mind. It's usually tied to vegetarianism as well, and they do not care what the facts are. So there's no way, and they're just going to put that stuff out. And you have the same political dynamics sometimes on the far right under other things. This is a hoax. This is that. This is this. I mean, think about it. There were members of the House Freedom Caucus last December arguing against the year-round E15 provision that was in the CR at that time, claiming it was a subsidy. No, no money was tied to it. No incentive was tied to it. It was a regulatory fix, or that it was a mandate. Now, I know at least one of the 2 or 3 people that spoke on that was smart enough to know what they were saying wasn't true. The others, I'm not sure. Maybe they honestly believed what they were saying and they were just completely wrong. But it's become harder to have to argue with some of these things because, and like I said, the pendulum swings. But I really find that a lot of people now, we're very tribal. This is my group, and as soon as I picked up my decision, where I'm going to stand, I'm with them no matter what. I'll change my position the second they change their position, and no amount of facts, logic, or common sense will ever come between me and the camp that I've decided to be in. And that it makes me sad, to be honest with you. I tell my teenage kids sometimes, they'll ask me questions about what's going on. I just remind them, like, it doesn't have to be this way. We can have factually based decisions, and we can argue over certain things and try to let it come to the front, the truth come to the front over time. But and sometimes we just disagree, right? You can have honest disagreements, but I just find that right now people aren't interested in thinking quite often. They've made up their mind. This is a new Green Deal. It's bad. I don't want to support it. Well, it's actually this, and this, and this, which you do support. Well, I don't. Or the other side where it's just like, oh, it's bad for the environment. Farming's bad. Really? How, okay, so if we go away from modern agriculture, you want 2 billion people to starve to death? I mean, let's have a discussion that looks at, facts, that looks at the real world implications, and that isn't just like, it's like, oh, I want this, so I'm just going to pretend it's reality. We had that with some of these EV mandates. On timelines, even if EVs were great, and even if we should be doing all that stuff, the timelines weren't realistic at a minimum. And then I would argue that if you actually look at all the facts, they're not all that they're cracked up to be. So if you want to buy an EV, that's fine. I'm not opposed to you buying it, but let's at least have and they accelerate really quickly too. I used to race cars, so I mean, look, there's some performance aspects of them that aren't too bad. But let's be honest about it, right? Let's talk
Right.
about those pros. Let's talk about the cons. Let's talk about where that battery and the materials in that battery comes from, and what that's meant for child labor. What that's meant for deforestation, and even some claims of slave labor in South America. So let's be honest. Let's not pretend that it just magically, it's kind of like the people who think that food grows in the supermarket, right?
Yeah.
We need people to lean in and have better discussions.
I to relate it to more of a everyday person perspective as well. I think it's important to just note from my perspective. I see renewable fuels as a complicated subject. There's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of details within it, and as humans, just being overwhelmed by details that we don't necessarily need to know on a day-to-day basis is overwhelming. It's a lot. And I think of it, when I'm reading the news or something like that, I'm just like, I don't even know if I want to care about this, because it's just, it makes me feel so like overwhelmed. I can't know enough. It's not possible for me to spend all the time needed to research and verify every fact that I'm not specialized in, or not, in the
And,
neighborhood of.
and
And
go
yeah,
ahead.
no, and to just let you talk there, what do you think of that? Like, how do you think that needs to be changed or worked with?
Well, that's been anymore. It's like I've said the word science. I'm old. I have a certain notion in my mind. Verifiable, repeatable things is science.
Yeah,
Um, the word science is now thrown around as my science is better than your science. I mean, it's in fact, when I hear someone say science now, I'm almost immediately skeptical, because that word has been perverted between things that um, you know so-called studies where the outcomes were predetermined and no one can repeat or replicate them.
yeah,
So you do have to sort through it, and that's where I think the word common sense comes in. You know, we don't seem to be a society much anymore that wants to admit that there's things that aren't perfect, right? We want perfect things. Nothing's perfect. I have never in any interview ever said biofuels were perfect. In fact, I oftentimes say, they're not perfect. But if you look at the alternatives, they're pretty darn good. And they check a lot of very positive boxes. And quite frankly, if you look at the alternatives that are available today, maybe somebody will come up with some magic pixie dust tomorrow. And if they do, great for the world. But in the meantime, if you actually try to just use your brain a little bit and look at some stuff, that a battery doesn't just appear. Where does it come from? So when they tell you, I mean, right away, when you label something a zero emissions vehicle, right there, if you have any common sense at all, and I'm not talking about you specifically, we know you don't, David, but
we know I don't.
listen, right? If
For all
you,
the smart people listening.
I told you I'd get you back for that earlier on, but if you have any common sense, right there, your antenna should go up, right? Zero emissions vehicle. That's odd, because there's something sitting in front of you that was not created by a magic wand. Energy went into the creation of a vehicle. It goes into the creation of the battery. So let's just start by and that was a politically driven narrative. I think you have to be skeptical, but I feel like the pendulum's gone so far beyond that. I even see it in my own kids sometimes, where it is so hard sometimes to find truthful sources, credible sources, that they've gone from being skeptical to just giving up. And
Yeah.
so, and then I think that's where you get these tribal things. Well, hell, I don't know. So, I'm voting for this guy, so I'm just going to believe what he says, even though I know some of it's probably not true. That makes me sad. We used to care about people being forthcoming, and now it seems like whoever can get the best bumper sticker out there on social media, we like them until we don't. And so, I don't know how we do that, except I'm just going to keep doing what I've done for 25 years now. And that is trying to the best of my ability to be a credible person for talking about biofuels. And yeah, I grew up on a farm. My family still farms. I help farm. I tease and call myself a farmer because I still have the same job I did 35 years ago, which is I get to drive the grain cart at harvest time. So that makes me a farmer.
Right. Yeah.
And 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 but I'm not, no, there, farming isn't perfect, but there's the people who want to point out how it's not perfect. We have this in the Des Moines area right now a lot. Oh, you're doing this and this and this. Well, yes, and think about how much that's changed since the 70s. I think back to my grandpa farming, and he didn't think about soil loss or water runoff or these things. My dad was one of the first people to no-till down in Southwest Iowa, and it was, it was like, that's crazy. You're doing what? And now we're graduating kids from Iowa State that know how to add carbon to the soil through their farming
Right.
practices. And so even that's not perfect, but we're trying to feed, I don't know, what are we up to? 6, 7, 8 billion people now.
It changes. Sometimes it's 8, sometimes it's 9.
All right. Well, I'll just go with 8. I won't over exaggerate. I usually like to exaggerate with numbers, but I won't today. But we're trying to feed 8 billion people, and think about this. We have, we can argue over the science of how long man has roamed the earth, right?
Right.
But we have about 10,000 years of recorded human history where we have some snippets and fragments of what was going on at the time.
Yes.
And during 9,930 of those years, I'm rounding, we did not produce enough calories to feed the human population at that time, even when it was much, 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 much smaller.
Yep.
Someone was going to go to bed hungry. Since about the 1950s, we now produce enough calories around the world so that no one would have to go to bed hungry. Now, certainly due to geopolitics and wealth and different things, I'm not saying people don't go to bed hungry. Yes, people do. But we now have the capability to actually, before, even if you had a magic wand to magically disperse food to wherever it needed to be, someone was still going to be hungry. Now we can feed the world, and we have enough starch left over to fuel a big portion of the world. I mean, it is amazing how far we've come. And I guess that's the part where I get frustrated, is when people, just want to, yes, we can talk about the shortcomings and how to be even better today than we were yesterday, and even better than we were in the 1970s. But to ignore what modern agriculture has done, to me, it's been more amazing than the fact that we put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. I think the technological innovations and what it's meant for mankind, from the agricultural revolution of the last 70 years, does not get the attention it deserves. It has been truly breathtaking. And as far as an impact on our modern life, I mean, look, I'm glad they developed Velcro. I like Velcro. But I mean, in terms of what it's meant to an ordinary person, the revolution in agriculture has had more impact than just about anything.
I fully agree, and I think it's good to even link those two things. If you have even the idea of mankind is supposed to grow and prosper and multiply, then you would think that the stars might be the next goal, and that means space and food need to be fuel for space need to be all crafted here somehow.
We got it in cars. We're working on putting it in airplanes. So rocket ships next. Here we go.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing. So I just want people to realize that farmers are very good at what they do, and that's why your food is cheap relative to anywhere in the world. And yes, we have enough. We have enough to do that. And think about this: of all the corn that goes into an ethanol plant, no kernel of corn goes into the ethanol plant that was actually being grown before the RFS was passed in 2005. And we do that on fewer acres today than we did in 2005. The productivity on a per acre basis has grown so much that we can produce all of the ethanol we do. And oh, by the way, you don't just get ethanol, you get distillers grains, high protein feed. All that protein from those new kernels of corn are in the feed market. And we still have as much corn left over that doesn't go to an ethanol plant as we were growing when the ethanol industry really started to grow fast in the early 2000s.
Not to mention the hand sanitizers. We really liked that during the past few years. That was helped a lot by those ethanol plants too.
I had some cases and cases and cases that left over. Now I squirt it on my fireplace, my fire pit outside. It's a pretty good fire starter too. Do not try that inside though. That's an outside fire starter tip. If you happen to have, if you had a wife that really stocked up, there are other uses.
Monte Shaw is the executive director of the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, joining me on the 20th anniversary of the Renewable Fuel Standard. Monte, thank you so much for your time today, and good luck on the next 20 years.
All righty. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again, Monte. This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports, as well as WHO TV Channel 13 every weekday in their morning and noon hour programs. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again on Monday, everybody. Have a good weekend.